I assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
To try and challenge
free and uncorrupted communication.
One of my primary aims in developing Catholic studies here at USB has been to surface questions out of reflection on the Catholic tradition that allow us to explore issues of broad interest for the study of religion, the academy, and the wider community. One of the features of the Catholic Church that I think is rather hard to miss is its sheer size and longevity as an institution. Indeed, it is undoubtedly the world's oldest and largest transnational institution. At a time when we are all very aware of globalization and the important role of transnational corporations in international affairs, it seems appropriate to consider how religious bodies function as transnational institutions. While it seems evident that the Catholic Church's distinctive structure allows it to play a different sort of role in the global arena than most other religious bodies, it's not clear how different Catholicism is in this regard from other traditions, and exactly what sort of difference its distinctive structure makes in the role that it plays internationally. This conference has been designed to allow us to explore that question in a comparative and interdisciplinary way. So in planning the conference, we knew we wanted to open with someone who really understands the institutional workings of the Catholic Church. Someone who could explain to us exactly what it is that's distinctive about the Church as an institution. For this opening keynote address, we could think of no one more ideally suited to this task than Thomas Reese, S.J. Dr. Reese holds an M.A. in political science from St. Louis University, a Master's of Divinity from the Jesuit School of Theology, and a doctorate in political science from UC Berkeley. He's the author of a trilogy that examines church organization and politics on the local, national, and international levels. The first book in the trilogy was titled Archbishop: Inside the Power Structure of the American Catholic Church. The second, A Flock of Shepherds, the National Conference of Catholic Bishops. And the third, most relevant to our topic tonight, Inside the Vatican, the Politics and Organization of the Catholic Church. Dr. Reese was an associate editor for America, a national Catholic weekly magazine, from 1978 until 1985. He was then a senior fellow at the Woodstock Theological Center at Georgetown University from 1986 to 1998, and editor of America from 1998 until 2005. He is currently a visiting scholar at Santa Clara University and will return beginning in July of 2006 to the Woodstock Theological Center as a senior fellow. Finally, I should add that for those of you who do not know of Father Reese through his books or through America Magazine, you may well remember him as a regular and most insightful commentator during the round-the-clock television coverage of the papal funeral and the election of Pope Benedict last year. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Thomas Reese.
Thank you, Anne, for those kind words of introduction. I'm also very honored and grateful to be the first one to speak in this lecture in honor of a Franciscan. The Jesuits and the Franciscans have a long history, and we have a great debt to the Franciscan community. that's very little known outside of Jesuit circles. St. Ignatius, the founder of the Society of Jesus, was a very practical man towards the end of his life. Early in his life, he was not a very practical man. And he felt inspired to go to the Holy Land. And when he left, he got on the ship, and then he said, wait a minute, I still have some money in my pocket. So he ran back, put the money on the dock, and then got back onto the ship, and then went off to the Holy Land, and was going to support himself by begging, and was going to try and convert the Muslims. Luckily, the Franciscans were in charge of the Holy Land. They took one look at this guy and said, go home. So he did, and he founded the Society of Jesus. So we have a great debt to the Franciscans. When I was a student at the University of California at Berkeley, I remember seeing a list of the impossible questions that no student wanted to see on a final exam. And the one for historians, Father Bishop Tom Curry, of course, is a historian, so he'll appreciate this one. The question that was on the list of impossible questions, the one for historians was, describe the impact of the Catholic Church on the religious, social, political, cultural, and economic life of Europe. Our project during this symposium is not quite so wide, but still is ambitious, to try and look at the Catholic Church as a global actor. The first thing we need to be clear about is, what do we mean by the Catholic Church? For some, the term is synonymous with the Pope or the Vatican. Others use the term Catholic Church to refer to the hierarchy, the bishops and the Pope. But the Catholic Church is also all the people of God. So when we speak of the Catholic Church as a global actor, we could be referring to the Pope, the Vatican, the bishops' conferences, organizations like Caritas and Catholic Relief Services, religious orders like the Jesuits and the Franciscans, individual Catholic diplomats, politicians, and the people in general. In the documents of the Second Vatican Council, the word church is used in in more than a dozen different ways. So whenever the word church is used, we need to really ask the speaker what they mean when they're using that term. In my presentation, I will focus primarily on only one part of the Catholic Church, the Holy See, colloquially referred to as the Vatican. I am not saying that other parts of the church are unimportant as global actors, but simply that in the time I have, this will be my focus. I have been asked to talk about how and why the Catholic Church is different from other religious players on the international scene. There are, I believe, at least 3 factors that make the Holy See different from other religious players on the international scene. First, its status under international law. Second, its diplomatic organization. And third, its agenda. The Holy See's status under international law is unique. It is a recognized international entity and has the right to diplomatic relations with states and international organizations. This status is based on historical practice that extends back into history to the beginning of diplomacy. Since the 4th century, and well before there were any papal states, popes have sent envoys to emperors and kings and have received ambassadors from nations. Even after the papal states were conquered by Italy in 1870, countries continued to exchange ambassadors with the Holy See during the period prior to the Lateran Treaty in 1929, which normalized relations between the Holy See and Italy and left the Holy See with a 108-acre city-state. The Vatican argues, and most international lawyers agree, that countries have diplomatic relations not with the Vatican city-state, but with the Holy See as head of the Catholic Church. This is unique. Today, 174 of the 192 United Nations member states, China, of course, is the major exception, exchange diplomatic representatives with the Holy See. They are ambassadors to the Holy See, not to the Vatican City-State. The Holy See also has member or observer status in more than 30 international organizations. This special status of the Holy See has wide international support. In fact, when the Holy See's observer status at the United Nations was attacked and challenged by Catholics for Free Choice and other groups, the Holy See's special status was spelled out in a UN resolution approved unanimously on July 1st, 2004. For the United States, however, diplomatic relations with the Holy See were sometimes a problem because of anti-Catholicism and concerns about separation of church and state. The first representative to the Holy See was a council appointed by George Washington in 1797. This consular office was upgraded to a legation by President Polk in 1848, and 4 different ministers were appointed and confirmed by the Senate and served until 1867, when diplomatic relations were cut off because of anti-Catholic feeling and because Italy had taken over the Papal States. President Roosevelt, however, sent a personal representative to the Holy See in 1939. And this assistant the man's assistant, was actually given diplomatic status secretly by the United States in order to keep him from being thrown out of Italy during the Second World War. Since he had diplomatic status, he was able to stay in the Vatican City-State. Actually, President Truman tried to normalize and upgrade this to the ambassadorial level, but this was rejected. But finally, under President Reagan in 1983, diplomatic relations with the Holy See were reestablished by the United States. They were challenged, however, in court. And I have a section in my paper, which I'm going to skip over, of the legal controversy that went on over that. But ultimately, the courts decided, both a federal district court in Philadelphia and then an appeals court, decided that, yes, the President of the United States does have the right to appoint and to establish diplomatic relations with anybody he wants to, in any international entity. The rationale behind U.S. diplomatic relations is purely pragmatic and secular. It is in the American self-interest to have a representative at the Vatican. As the Justice Department's brief stated, To the extent that the views of the Holy See command respect and attention on the world scene, it is imperative that the positions and interests of the United States be communicated and understood before the views of the Holy See are formulated and aired to the world. So this position of having an ambassador to the Holy See was reviewed by the courts and accepted, and we've had one ever since. Now, the second way that the Catholic Church is unusual and unique is that the Catholic Church, as a global actor, has an organization in order to fulfill its role as a global actor that is different and unique from any other religion. It is obviously easier for a hierarchical organization led by a monarch to act in international affairs than it is for an organization with dispersed powers. Although the Pope cannot command blind obedience, he is at a minimum a central authority who has the right to speak and act in the name of the Church. Few large religions have such an authority. In addition, the Vatican Secretariat of State and its embassies around the world give the Pope the bureaucratic mechanism to make his presence felt in international affairs in a way that no other religion can. The top official at the Holy See under the Pope is the Secretary of State, currently Cardinal Angelo Sodano, who really, they call him the Secretary of State, but he is really more like a prime minister than our Secretary of State. The Secretariat of State has two offices. The first section for general affairs, headed by the Sostituto, and the second section for relations with states, headed by the Secretary for Relations with States. Although there are numerous exceptions, the principal work of the first section is the internal life of the Church, internal church issues, while the second section deals with international issues. Both sections are really rather small. The second section, which would be the equivalent of our Foggy Bottom, has a total staff of 40 people. The first section is divided into language groups, and the Sostituto acts as the Pope's chief of staff. He's like the chief of staff in the White House. Most documents and correspondence going to and from the Pope go through him, which makes him one of the most powerful people in the Vatican, even though he is only an archbishop. The second section is the one that we focus on tonight, which is divided into country desks, very much like our, Secretary of State is in Washington. It's organized into country desks and is the equivalent of the foreign ministry and has the Secretary for Relations with States as its head. He is the true foreign minister of the Vatican. At one time, these two offices, one was called the Office for General Affairs, and was called the Office for Ordinary Affairs. And then the other office was called the Office for Extraordinary Affairs, which led to a rather humorous situation one time when a bishop was caught having an affair with a woman, and the little Monsignor came running into Archbishop Tardini, who was in charge of extraordinary affairs, and said, "This bishop, he's been having an affair." And he said, Give that to Montini. It's an ordinary affair. Which I think led Montini, who then became Paul VI, to change the names of the offices. The Vatican has been described by diplomats who are ambassadors there as one of the great listening posts in the world, because Vatican officials have a wealth of information that comes to them from nuncios, bishops, religious orders, who periodically come to Rome and make reports about what is happening all over the world. For example, when I was interviewing the prefect for the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, I was interviewing him for my book, Inside the Vatican, we were interrupted by a telephone call from a bishop in Rwanda who was reporting to him that, the president's plane had just been shot down, which of course was the beginning of that horrible situation in Rwanda that followed. And, I was sitting there while he was getting this phone call from a bishop telling him what was going on and, reporting on what was happening in Rwanda. With its network of bishops and priests, the Vatican can actually sometimes more quickly and accurately find out what is happening in some parts of the world than can the CIA. Ambassadors and their staff praise the quality of the officials that they meet in the Secretariat of State. And most of them are priests who work in the Secretariat of State and work in the diplomatic and in the embassies of the Vatican around the world. And these people are trained. These priests are trained in a special school called the Pontifical Ecclesiastical Academy, sometimes referred to as the West Point of the Vatican. Young priests are recruited for the academy and spend 4 years studying canon law, languages, international law, diplomatic history, ecclesiastical diplomacy, and what they call diplomatic writing. How to write a report and letters back to your bosses in Rome. In the past, the student body was practically all Italian. Now it is international, with a large third world contingent. After completing his training, a graduate is sent to work in a nunciature, an embassy of the Holy See, as an assistant to the nuncio, which is the term they use for ambassador. And normally he would be moved every 3 years and would spend some time back in Rome. It would be 18 to 20 years before he became a nuncio. If one visits the nunciatures around the world, one notices that even if the nuncio is Italian, most of the priest secretaries and assistants are from the third world. In another generation, third world clerics will dominate the Vatican diplomatic corps, and eventually will be running the Vatican and the Catholic Church. With nunciatures in almost every country, the Vatican's reach is truly global. Although the staffs in the nunciatures are small, the nuncios actually have more contact with a wider cross-section of society than do most ambassadors. Most ambassadors spend most of their time in the capital meeting with government officials. If the American ambassadors started running around the country, talking to other people, the local government would not like that to begin with. The nuncio can get away with that. He goes around talking to bishops, priests, saying Mass in different places, and as a result, often gets a feel for what's going on in the country that has a lot more depth to it than the people who attend cocktail parties in the Capitol. The Vatican also works in league with local bishops and bishops' conferences. For example, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has taken positions on international issues that are in sync with those of the Vatican, even when those positions are not popular in the United States. For example, the U.S. bishops supported U.S. recognition of Vietnam and Cuba despite the opposition of the Vietnamese and Cuban communities in the United States. They also supported the forgiveness of third world debt, increases in development aid, and restrictions on aid to fund abortions abroad. Now, no religion has such an extensive and complex organization for promoting its global agenda. Which gets us to the third point in my talk, the global agenda of the Catholic Church. Comparing the Holy See's global agenda with the agenda of other religions is difficult, because of the multiplicity of religions and the fact that most other religions don't have a central authority like the Holy See. The Holy See's global agenda can be classified into, I think, 4 categories. First, promoting the religious freedom and the position of the local churches in their country. Second, promoting justice and peace as articulated in Catholic social teaching. And third, promoting and protecting the position of the Holy See. Please note that I am ignoring the role of the Holy See and its nuncios in the internal governance of the Church, which is beyond the scope of the conference we're having, and yet is an extremely important part of what the nuncios are involved in. So first, promoting the religious freedom of local churches is a principal goal of Vatican diplomacy. In the 20th century, Vatican diplomats had to deal with fascists and communist regimes that severely limited the freedom of the church to preach the gospel, administer sacraments, educate children in the faith, and do works of charity. The church's tactics and compromises in dealing with totalitarian regimes are much debated by historians, but its options were rather limited when faced with government thugs willing to use force and violence against church officials and members. Today, Vatican diplomats work for greater freedom for the church in China and Islamic countries. Cuba, Vietnam, India, and Israel are also places where the Vatican fights for the independence and rights of the Church. Since the Second Vatican Council, the Holy See has supported not just freedom of religion for Catholics, but also, as a matter of principle, religious freedom for all religions. Thus, the Catholic Church has been vocal in defending the religious rights of Muslims in Europe. Where religious freedom is practiced, the Vatican will work to protect and enhance the position of the Church, for example, through government funding of Catholic schools and charities. This is not done, however, in the United States, where such actions by the Vatican would be seen as interference and where the local church can speak for itself. But in some countries, especially in Catholic countries, the Vatican plays an active role, and church-state relations are regulated by concordats, which which are treaties, actually international treaties, which the Vatican sees as more binding and permanent than local laws, which of course can be changed or ignored for local political reasons. For a country to unilaterally break a concordat would be the same as unilaterally breaking a treaty. Promoting justice and peace is another goal of Vatican foreign policy. Catholic social teaching provides the intellectual framework for its positions on justice and peace, based on the Gospels, the natural law, Vatican II, papal encyclicals. Catholic social teaching encourages Catholics to work together with all people of goodwill for international peace and justice. Promoting justice and peace is also a goal of most religions, but few have as developed a theory as Catholic social teaching on which to base their policies and actions. Over the years, the Vatican has been a staunch supporter of the League of Nations and the United Nations. Its support for international courts, respect for international law, have been consistent for decades. While it acknowledges that war can sometimes be just, it has stressed the use of diplomacy and negotiations to resolve disputes. In March of 2003, for example, before the Second Gulf War, John Paul II sent Cardinal Pio Loggi to try and talk President George W. Bush out of going to war. And the president, during the conversation, at one point, says, yeah, but we agree on so many things like abortion and stem cell research and cloning and this, and Cardinal Loggi just cut him off and he says, I'm here to talk about something else, the war, the possibility of war in the Gulf. So it was a very interesting meeting, but unsuccessful, obviously. Vatican foreign policy has supported the peaceful resolution of international disputes, has supported human rights, disarmament, forgiveness of third world debt, aid to refugees and poor countries, women's rights, while opposing international financing and promotion of abortion. It has spoken out on the downside of globalization, and at the end of John Paul's papacy, it was also becoming more vocal on environmental issues and global warming. Probably its most controversial positions of late have been its opposition to both Gulf wars and its opposition to abortion funding through foreign aid and international agencies. The Church's position on condoms and AIDS has also been controversial, but appears to be changing. Finally, another goal of the Holy See's foreign policy is simply its continued existence and influence as a global actor. It successfully put on a full-court press to preserve and enhance its position at the United Nations. Under the July 1st, 2004 resolution, the Holy See gained the right to participate in the general debate held each year in the opening days of the General Assembly. Now, how successful has the Holy See been in international relations? And what might the future hold? It is, of course, very difficult to measure the impact of the Holy See as a global actor, since other factors besides its efforts go into determining what happens in the world. With regards to its goal of furthering religious liberty and the status of local churches, it was very successful under John Paul II, who through his support of Solidarity and the Polish freedom movement began the landslide that wiped out communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. It was also very successful in renegotiating the church-state relations in Italy. Elsewhere, the results are mixed, with improvements in some places and declines elsewhere, most recently in Spain. The two biggest challenges are China and Islamic countries. Despite numerous formal and back-channel initiatives by the Vatican, relations with China, as opposed to Vietnam, have not improved very much. In the future, progress may be made with China, not because of any change in Vatican policy, but simply because the Chinese officials are probably less afraid of Benedict than they were of John Paul. They remembered what John Paul did in Poland, and they did not want the same thing to happen in China. But I don't think they have that worry about Benedict. But eventually, China is going to recognize that its own self-interest is in recognizing and establishing relations with the Vatican to improve its image in terms of human rights. A key issue will be the Vatican's control over the appointment of bishops. And just recently, 2 bishops have been appointed by the local communist-run Patriotic Church, which has put this whole improvement in relations back a notch. Meanwhile, the situation of Catholics in the Middle East is deteriorating. Radical Islam is making life difficult for Christians in many Islamic countries. And every indication is that matters will get worse. The war in Iraq has made the situation for Catholics worse than it was under Saddam. And the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians makes the position of Catholic Palestinians more difficult. Meanwhile, Israel continues to avoid serious negotiations over the legal and financial status of the church, which it's promised to regularize after diplomatic relations were established in 1994. Many in the Vatican, including the new Pope, appear to favor a tougher line with Muslims. The only well-known foreign policy position of Cardinal Ratzinger was his opposition to the entry of Turkey into the European Union because it did not share Europe's Christian roots. The removal recently of Archbishop Michael Fitzgerald as head of the Council for Interreligious Dialogue is also disconcerting, and seems to be motivated by a desire to demand reciprocity from Islamic countries. For example, Saudi money built in Rome the largest mosque in Europe, but Catholics cannot have a church in Saudi Arabia. Church officials defend the rights of Muslims in Europe, but few mullahs defend the rights of Christians in Islamic countries. Demanding reciprocity has its merits, I think, but the church cannot backslide on the principle of religious liberty by making religious liberty for Muslims in Europe conditional on religious liberty of Christians in the Middle East. That is simply not an acceptable strategy. If the Vatican is seen as being insensitive about Islam, it could cost lives in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. This may be the most difficult global issue facing the Church in the 21st century. With regards to working for justice and peace, one might say that the Holy See failed because there is little justice and peace in the world. It failed to stop the World War I and World War II. It also failed to be accepted as a broker for peace in those conflicts. But granted the position of the belligerents, these failures were not surprising. Without military or economic power, the Holy See promotes its foreign policy principally through persuasion of governing elites and appeals to public opinion. On the other hand, the Holy See was able to facilitate some humanitarian actions during and after the 20th century wars. One might also argue that John Paul did more to end the Cold War than any other world leader. Pope John Paul was also instrumental in preventing war between Chile and Argentina over the Beagle Channel. He also played a major role in the campaign to forgive Third World debt. And although the Vatican's efforts at the 1994 Cairo Conference on Population and Development were controversial, it certainly did have an impact. But its real success is perhaps simply keeping the issues of justice and peace on the international agenda. Some question whether the issues of justice and peace will be as high a priority under Benedict XVI as they were under John Paul II. In comparing John Paul and Benedict, Cardinal Avery Dulles last fall described Pope John Paul as a social ethicist who wanted to, quote, involve the church in shaping a world order of peace, justice, and fraternal love, close quote. While Pope Benedict, quote, expects the church to maintain a posture of prayer and worship and is suspicious of social activism and of human claims to be building the kingdom of God, close quote. Likewise, the second half of Benedict's first encyclical has been criticized for proceeding in such a way that the notion of justice is thoroughly eclipsed by the practice of charity, that in the end it may fall short of the rich heritage of justice discourse within the Catholic Church. It's also noticeable that when Benedict speaks, he is much more comfortable talking about internal church issues, liturgy, prayer, sacraments, devotions, theology, than he is in talking about international issues. When giving a speech on internal church issues, he often ad-libs. But when speaking on international issues, he keeps to the text, which is often prepared by the Secretary of State. On the other hand, no pope today can ignore the big international issues. No matter what he does, they're going to end up on his desk, whether he wants it or not. Finally, there is the goal of promoting and protecting the position of the Holy See. Here, the Vatican has been extremely successful. As I mentioned, 174 out of the 194 UN members have diplomatic relations with the Holy See. One might argue, however, that it's the first goal, defending the local church, and the third goal, protecting the position of the Holy See, can sometimes conflict with its second goal, working for justice and peace. Does protecting its institutional base conflict with its prophetic voice? Of course. The Holy See makes compromises and is willing to deal with practically any regime that is in power. It must inevitably be a practitioner of realpolitik. For example, while currently suspicious of U.S. foreign and military policy, the Holy See wants good relations with the world's superpower. It also seeks to improve relations with Islam, whether democratic or dictatorial regimes, as essential to diffusing the religious conflicts in the Middle East and in Africa and Asia. It has also been willing to maintain good relations with oppressive regimes in Latin America. How well or how badly it balances its efforts towards these sometimes conflicting goals should be a subject of debate. And although the role of the Holy See in internal church governance is beyond the scope of this particular conference, the Holy See's actions on the life of the church can have external ramifications. For example, the Holy See's attacks on American moral theologians hindered the church's ability to contribute positively to discussions of how to deal with AIDS, homosexual rights, and population control. Its attacks on liberation theologians hindered the ability of the church to respond to issues of justice in Latin America. And its attacks on Asian theologians examining relations between Christianity and non-Christian religions have made interreligious dialogue more difficult. And its attacks on academic freedom at Catholic universities have soured the relationship between the hierarchy and theologians, which has hindered the church's ability to come up with creative ideas in a rapidly changing world. In general, however, I am a strong supporter of the role of the Holy See as a global actor. I think that the world is a better place because of it. I have more problems personally with its role in the internal life of the church, but that's the subject of another conference. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Reese. You mentioned in your talk that in another generation, the Third World clerics will dominate the Vatican diplomatic corps. And my question is, how do you think that will influence and change the global agenda of the Catholic Church? And I'm thinking particularly of your book, Inside the Vatican, where you mention, for example, that African culture, there's not much support for clerical celibacy, theological distinctions created in Europe, and canon law. So if you comment on that, thank you.
Okay. Could everybody hear the question? Okay, good. It's going to be very interesting to see what will be the impact on the Catholic Church when the Third World clergy, who are in kind of the lower level positions right now in the Vatican, begin to have the top jobs. It's going to be extremely interesting to see what impact that has. I think that certainly it will put Third World political and social agenda on the top of the pile. The concern for the fact that people are hungry and starving and unemployed, the impact of globalization in the Third World, all of these kinds of things that you hear these cries from the Third World debt. A lot of these things were already the agenda of John Paul II, but I think they will become even more the agenda of a Vatican that is run by Third World clergy. I think certainly those things, I think that's going to be pretty clear. We're going to see a lot more suspicion of the United States and the First World, and I think that's going to be strong and vocal. In terms of how it's going to impact the life of the church, that's a whole nother ballgame, and one that I'm not too sure of. Partially because the Third World priests who are recruited to the Vatican are a certain kind of Third World priests who have basically accepted the positions of the Vatican. Why go work there if you don't like what they're doing? Although it is one of the impacts is it is a better lifestyle for most Third World priests to come and work in the Vatican, whereas People in the United States think they've gone to the third world when they go to Italy, except for the food. Now, will that? So I don't think we're going to see suddenly a liberalization of the church. I mean, look at the Anglican Communion. Where is the conservative voice in the Anglican community? It's in Africa right now, in the fights in the divisions that are going on in the Anglican Church. So don't hold your breath for the third world bishops to come and be a strong liberal voice in the church. Certainly, they're well. I think that's enough. Yes, I'll try and go back.
My name's Mike Murphy. Just some definitions that I didn't understand and wanted to better understand. When you say that the Holy See versus the Vatican city-state, there's a difference you have there. Also, I didn't understand when you talked about the encyclical, the first encyclical, you were suggesting something about charity versus social justice.
I'm sorry, yeah.
And then along that line, lastly, is what might we be able to predict about a pope whose first encyclical was about love and charity and the organization on a global action?
Good question. First, the difference between the Holy See and the Vatican city-state. Well, the Vatican city-state is that 108 acres in the middle of Rome. Well, not in the middle of Rome. It's on the other side of the river. But it's surrounded by Rome. And it is a state. It's like Monaco, or it's an international boundary, and they have their own post office. They've got their own stamps. They even can coin some euro coins. It is an independent nation, and the Pope is the monarch of it. Now, of course, if Italy turned off the water and the electricity, they'd be in trouble. But now, when we talk about the Holy See, the word "see" comes from Santa Sedes. It's the seat. It's the same root word for diocese. It's the chair in the cathedral where the bishop sits and teaches. I see the bishop back there smiling as I'm trying to explain this. It's the Holy See. It's because he is the Bishop of Rome, and therefore the head of the successor of Peter and the head of the College of Bishops. So the Vatican is very adamant on this, that when someone has diplomatic relations, it's with the Holy See. It's with the Bishop of Rome. It's with the Pope as head of the Catholic Church. Even if Italy took away those 108 acres, he would still have the right to have diplomatic relations with all of the nations of the world. Now, the United States has a hard time swallowing that. They did some legal gymnastics. Actually, at one time, one of the representatives, back when it was a personal representatives, he had a little card. He actually had two sets of cards. When he was in Rome, it said representative to the Holy See. When he was in the United States, it said representative to the Vatican. So depending on which country he was in, he would be handing these things out. But the way the United States finally got around it was to say, yes, we have diplomatic relations with the Holy See, which is the Pope, who happens to be the head of the Catholic Church, but he's also the head of Vatican City-State. And they compare it to, we have diplomatic relations with the Court of St. James, the Queen, who is also the head of the Church of England. Not quite the same thing, but at least it keeps all the constitutional legal scholars happy, and didn't matter anyway because the court just threw the case out of court and said the president can do whatever he wants in this area. I'm sorry, you had the encyclical. The Pope's first encyclical was on charity, Deus Caritas Est, and the second half of it was on the role of charity in the church, the care for the poor. And the critique of it by some people was that it talked too much about charity and not enough about justice. There is a role for the church in working for a just society. I'm not sure he was denying that. I think it's a matter of emphasis. But in any case, that was a critique that he had. And it's kind of coming from, I think, his kind of background. In a speech he gave to diplomats, he said that the path to peace, that truth is the path to peace. I don't have the exact words here, but it was something along those lines. If you talk to most diplomats, they would not say truth is the path to peace. Usually lying, ambiguity, compromise. But, saying truth is the path to peace is quite different from what Paul VI said at the United Nations, where he came and said, if you want peace, work for justice. Now, that's a little different spin than saying truth is the path to peace. Also very different from John Paul II, who actually further developed, in an interesting way, Paul VI's thing. If I can remember exactly how it went. It was, if you want peace, work for justice, but in order to have justice, you must have forgiveness. Now that's a kind of an interesting spin, especially when you look at places like the Middle East, the old Yugoslavia, which were places he was very much looking at the time he was writing and speaking these words, the importance of forgiveness.